Hey folks, we are going to start a brand new series here, and I know this is one that our good friend Bill, Old 64 Goat, will absolutely appreciate. This is a record cutting machine amplifier, I believe, and this is something that Bill was able to pick up at a flea market, I believe, in Connecticut, and we worked it out, and he sent it down here to me. And I'm going to turn it into a guitar amplifier, and the reason why I love it is because of this meter. I love all this old analog meter stuff, and this is going to make a really nice amp. So on the front you've got the typical jewel. You've got your on-off switch. This is your volume. It's got a tone pot, it's got a volume pot, and it's got a switch here for record or phono, and it has a microphone connection underneath here, like so. So we're going to turn this into a guitar amplifier. Haven't decided what type of guitar amplifier yet. I'm probably going to use 9-pin tubes in this thing instead of the traditional 8-pin octals. But I've got plenty of time to make a decision on what I'm going to do. Let's take a look at this angle. So you'll see here it's got plenty of iron. It's got a really nice transformer. And that may be the deterrent for me from using those 9-pin tubes, because I really don't need a hefty transformer for those things. But we'll see. And you'll see here it has some tubes in it, which is good. And it's got an output transformer and a choke. And this is the meter. These are the pots underneath. And one thing you'll notice is that the rectifier tubes here are all the old 4-pin type. So all those sockets are going to come out anyway. And if we flip it upside down quickly, you'll see that there's really not much happening there. I don't want to rest it on that cover. You'll see that there's really not much happening in there. There's a lot of these old unreliable caps, which I know are unreliable. That just is the way it is. And there's not a lot happening under here. It's very original. No one's really been in it. You can see that it probably didn't get a lot of use either. It doesn't look like anything is fried or anything like that. So for me, it's going to be real simple. Just rip it all out and redo it. Now, I don't have a lot of depth in this chassis, so I'm going to have to be mindful of that. I'll probably end up doing point-to-point wiring instead of putting a turret board in there, and that's going to be the way I handle it. But I've got plenty of room, right? So the next step for me is going to be to figure out what type of amp I'm going to build. Is it going to be a Fender? Is it going to be a hybrid of a Fender and a Marshall? Is it going to be a Fender Champ, a single output tube? Don't really know. I mean, this thing has currently 7 tubes in it, so I'm not going to use 7 tubes. But I'll probably use a solid state rectifier, or I'll do a tube rectifier and a solid state and have a switchable switch there so you can go to either one, because there is a difference. I'm going to take a look at some of the designs that Terry Dayton from D-Lab has done, and I may utilize some of that here. But that's going to be what this series is about. So this is a pretty heavy amp. I mean, the iron makes it real heavy. But again, the thing I like the most about this is this faceplate and this meter. So we're going to preserve that. And when I do this, I'm going to need to figure out how I mount this in a cabinet somehow. So there's no cabinet. What you see is what you get. So the first step for me is going to be to disassemble this whole thing, get all it down, get down to brass tacks here on the bottom, look at the chassis. I have some de-rusting to do. I'll put it in the evaporust and see what we end up with, and that's the plan. So this is our new series. So I'd like to go back and forth between radios and amps, and I've spent the last 3 months on radios. So we're going to go back to an amp for this one. So anyway, I will keep you posted and come back in a little bit after I've got this all ripped apart. Okay, as you could see, I've removed this top panel, and I just trimmed all the wires back. I'm not going to use any of it. I'm not going to use those pots, and I'm not going to use that switch. I am going to use the meter, that's fine. And I'll use the light socket here. But everything else has just been snipped off, and I'll put that aside and work on that later. I've also taken off these side rails right here. Okay, so those have been removed. I'm going to give just a little public service announcement in case there's somebody watching this that's never worked on an old amp like this to try to restore it. A couple of things you need to know. First one is these electrolytic caps here. Never assume that they're discharged. Electrolytic caps can hold a charge for years in some cases. So if you ever get a piece of old equipment, never assume that there's no danger. You should always check the capacitors and put a resistor across them if they're charged. That's how you can discharge them quickly, so you should be careful there. The other thing is the metal that's used on these chassis. So back in the 40s and 50s, the plating wasn't what it is today. And I think they used all different kinds of techniques to plate these things. And you have to be really careful with these old electronics. Doesn't matter if it's an old radio or an amp. If you start to disturb the finish on these things and you breathe it, it's toxic. I remember there was a 1941 Philco 1201 that I worked on, Bing Crosby model. And when I flipped it over and took the turntable off and flipped it over, there was all this yellow powder on it. I had no idea what it was. And I was messing around with it and moving it and touching it and all kinds of stuff. And I did a little research and found out that it's dangerous to breathe it. And I actually felt like I had a cold for like 3 months after that. You have to be really careful with this stuff. If you see any kind of powder on any of these chassis, wear breathing protection and find a way to encapsulate it and get rid of it. Don't just assume that it's safe. So with this old chassis here, I see the plating is removed in some places, so I'm not sure what I'll do with this. I'm definitely going to throw it in the evaporust though, because it's definitely got some rust on it. But I'm going to strip the chassis down bare, remove all the sockets. I have some nice 8-pin sockets here I can save. Take all the iron off of there, get rid of these caps, and then we're going to decide what we do with the amp. So that's my public service announcement. Be careful, discharge your caps, and be careful of the metal that you see in these things. Just doing an inspection on this, I don't see any problem with the metal, but you never know. If you start drilling and grinding and stuff, it could be a problem. These wires coming out of this transformer are pretty rigid, so I'll have to look at that and see if I may need to rewire the transformer. I've done that a million times already. And I have to see what the windings are. I don't know what the windings are, but we'll save that for another time. So that's the story on this thing. And I'll continue to strip this thing back and show you in the next video when we start the series on video number 1 what we're doing here. Okay? So that's the story. That's what we're kicking off. And again, here's the meter. All right, it's not a lighted meter. I don't see any light bulbs in there. But clearly it connects to a sound source and there's a resistor there, and that's going to be the same way we connect it back. Alright, I want to show you one more thing in this Odds and Sods video, and then we'll end it, and then we'll start our series working on this one. I'll be right back. Okay, here we are back with the Hallicrafters 5R41, and I put a video up today because I was having an odd problem with this thing, being not working on the Variac, but working when plugged into the wall. And a lot of you came back and told me the reason, and it makes perfect sense now that I think about it. So this radio requires that the antenna be connected to earth ground. And my Variac is plugged directly into an isolation transformer. So that's why it wasn't working. So it was basically, it was turning on, there was power, you saw the B plus there, but it wasn't getting a signal. So that explains it. A couple of other things. When I was having the volume problem, I started poking around. One of the things I found was that my B plus was at only 85 volts DC, and the schematic calls for 90. So every little bit counts from a B plus perspective and can contribute to a volume problem. So what I did was, when I was scoping out the size of this resistor, I was scoping it out relative to the filament voltage, not the B plus voltage. So that's a mistake. So I put this thing back on the Clarostat box and found out that the resistor needs to be 80 ohms, not 120. So what you'll see here is a temporarily wired 80 ohm 5 watt resistor right there. And when I get the official 25 watt one, I'll put it in its place. So that increased my volume, but there was another problem as well that that hurt my volume, and I'm gonna show you what that was, and we'll talk you through that. I'll be right back. Okay, so the schematic for this radio calls for two capacitors that go between B negative and chassis ground. Okay, one is at 0.005 and one is at 0.2. Okay, and here's the mistake that I made. So this 0.2 right there, the way that I attached it to chassis ground was off of this filament resistor, which goes right here to the 1R5 tube. Not good. So basically, I was tying off that resistor directly to this filament resistor and then going to ground from here. That was a problem. It would decrease the volume of the radio, and I proved that by removing it. As soon as I removed it, the volume of the radio shot up. So lesson learned here is never tie anything to filament resistors. They need to be independent and do what they're supposed to do. In this case, it's the center tap. So that was my mistake. So I've moved it to a different location, and I now have a much better voltage and volume, I should say. So that was my other admission. So at this point, the radio actually. Oh, by the way, when I had that capacitor there, I wasn't able to align it correctly. For example, I have a whole house radio, whole house station on 800, and I was only able to tune it at 100. Right, so that's not good. So by removing that cap, everything is normally aligned now, and it sounds really good. So so that's the story. I'm going to put the radio on for you for 1 second, so you can hear it. And we're going to wrap it up on this radio. So as soon as that new resistor comes in, we're good to go. So let's plug it in. Turn it on.
Go to usbank.com to learn more. US Bank, the power of possible.
It's getting late here, so stations are starting to drop off.
Equals a member FDIC.
Wine and wildlife.
Yeah, there's only about one that's really strong right now.
Beers in a souvenir glass at the Westin Jekyll.
But that volume is perfectly acceptable. So anyway, works great now. I got plenty of stations this morning, and it's really good. So that's the story on this. I appreciate all your help with the power issue. Makes perfect sense. And just to close the loop on that, I'm going to unplug this before I start messing with it. If you look back here, right here, this is a ground lug, and the radio wants you to connect it to ground. So when I say that the radio needs a ground on the antenna, that's what I mean. One last admission before I end the video. The reason why I ripped this whole radio apart and started from scratch is because I couldn't get it to work. You know why I couldn't get it to work? Because it was plugged in the Variac. But that's okay. So if I had plugged it in the wall, it would have worked, and I wouldn't have had to restart from scratch. But that's okay, because I learned an awful lot about how to align it. I learned an awful lot about a lot of things, about grounding, all kinds of things. So so we're going to consider this my test radio and my learning radio, and I actually learned a lot about these old tube radios at this point. So that's where we are. And we'll put this back in the case when this resistor comes in, and we're good to go. So that's about it for now. Everybody have a great night, and we will see you in episode 1 of our new amplifier. I think we're going to call it the Goat Deluxe. I think that's what we're going to call this amp, but we'll see. We got time to make that decision. Everybody have a great night.